It was in the late Malefic era when the pre-literate humans, the Nedic peoples, came to Tamriel. The aboriginal beastfolk had already dwelt in Dawn's beauty for millennia. The Aldmer had already discovered the Somerset Isles. The Durani had claimed the Adamantine Tower, and the Aelids had replaced the bird people of the Heartland. The Chimera had made their exodus to Resdane, turning gold in the changing, and the Dwemer were busy uncovering the world's darkest secrets, deep beneath the ground in Tamriel's north and east. Tamriel already had a diverse range of cultures and civilizations, but the Nedes, they came with nothing. They were primitive in comparison, and it would be a great many years before Ysgramor and his lineage made way for the first empire of men. Those who remember Atmora, the homeland of the Nedes, would tell you of its magnificence, but also of its gradual death. The verdant summers in the Elder Wood were growing scarce, and winter's bitter grip on the continent was tightening each year. But in a land of frost and penetrating cold, the people were steeled by lifelong hardship. Every denizen was a predator, and only the most brutal and savage survived the winter snow. The elves of Tamriel may have perceived these early humans as benighted, but underestimating them would spell their eventual downfall. The Nedic settlers migrated to Dawn's beauty. They settled the comparably clement lands, and they were here to stay, whether the reigning empires of Mer liked it or not. Hey guys, it's Drew here and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. Everyone familiar with the Elder Scrolls knows about the Nords. These are the human descendants of Ysgramor and his Atmoran companions. Ysgramor's conquest of Skyrim is the most notable human migration to Tamriel, alongside the Yakudans who followed Frandar Hunding to Hammerfell. But Ysgramor's generation were not the first to come to Tamriel via the Sea of Ghosts, from the frigid expanses of Atmora. It is the migration that had the clearest direct impact on Tamriel, as this wave's rise to prominence happened over such a short span of time. And there is the added fact that Ysgramor was the first human settler to transcribe Nordic speech using Elven principles of writing, making him essentially the first human historian. But there were many Nedic migrations prior to Ysgramor's arrival, and their influence on the fate of Tamriel and its peoples shouldn't be underestimated. The Nedes are the ancestors of Bretons, Reachmen, Imperials, Nords, and even possibly the Kofringi, the lustrous folk of Blackmarsh. In today's video we're going to explore the lore and history of Tamriel's first men, the men who first found this southern elven frontier. The Malefic era of Mundus is dated like the BC in our world. The construction of the Adamantine Tower and the retreat of the gods back into Ephirius heralded the end of the Dawn era, and the beginning of the Malefic. ME 2500 is the first year after the Dawn, while ME 1 was the final year of the Malefic era. Malefic is a Nordic word, which translates to Era of the Elves. It is a fitting name given the state of Tamriel when the Nedes made their initial migrations. The Elves laid claim to all of Tamriel, excepting Blackmarsh, and for at least 1500 years they were largely uncontested. Then, between ME 1000 and 800, the Nedes started arriving on the northern shores, centuries before Ysgramor and his companions came. So what did these migrations look like before Ysgramor's famous return? When the Nedes first arrived in Tamriel, they did not come to wage war with the elves. Ysgramor and his companions were motivated by the desire to avenge the Night of Tears. But prior to this, the Nedes entering the continent largely just wanted to find a new home. Some became Proto-Cyrodiilian in the south, others became the ancestors to the Bretons in the west. Traces of them can be found in the deserts of Hammerfell, and there are even rumours of extinct men in the eastern lands of Morrowind and beyond. To these early settlers, Tamriel was the new world. They came and saw the lofty civilizations of the elves, and of course, their goal was to coexist peacefully, for these travellers had no hope of displacing these well-settled lands. For the most part, this coexistence was successful. The Mer considered the Nedes to be inferior as you'd expect, but they tolerated them the same way they do with any sub-elven race. As a result, the Nedes flourished, and gradually expanded their civilizations as far as they could without encroaching on elven territory. Inevitably, total segregation between the races was never going to be completely maintained, no matter how staunchly the elven race in question believed in their own superiority. The Nedes intermingled with their neighbours over the centuries, and became fully fledged inhabitants of Tamriel. To get a better look at the various Nedic civilizations, let's look at them individually based on location. We know the Nedes dispersed south, west and east, throughout ME 1800, so let's start with the ones who ventured west. The land of High Rock was ruled by the Durani Elves when the Nedes came. Compared to many other Nedic migrations, the Nedes of the northwest fared relatively well. They were subordinate to the Elves as you'd expect, but they were given a surprising degree of freedom to operate in Durani society, given that the humans were primitive in contrast with the highly sophisticated Elves. It would have been fairly easy for them to simply wipe out all the round-eared folk in their land. But instead, the Durani actually began interbreeding with the humans. As an Oldmer clan, the Durani maintained the belief that humans were beneath them, but I guess some elves took that a little too literally. Rather than enslaving or killing the Nedic tribes, like some other elven bad apples did further east, the Durani instead chose to establish themselves as the noble class, allowing the Nedes to live freely so long as they knew their place. According to Thrastus of Elenhir, the aristocratic elves established a system of feudal vassalage over their human subjects, with rights and privileges that included the perquisite of coition with any human they desired. Sex with attractive Nedes was considered casual recreation, and Durani nobles competed to have stables of the most desirable human subjects. So, with the normalizing of this kind of behaviour, a slew of half-elven, half-human children were introduced into Durani society. Being half-human still meant they were inferior to their pure-blooded ruling class, but the Man-Mer, or Bretons as they would come to be known, were given privileged positions among the Nedic subjects of High Rock. Of course, this kind of treatment is far from ideal. I'm sure many Nedic humans resented the domineering presence of the Durani, but considering that they were settling lands already occupied by elves who were far more powerful than them, it could have been a lot worse. And this intermingling of gene pools provided the Nedes with interesting opportunities. Bretons were only permitted to breed with other Bretons or full-blooded Nedes, which meant that most of High Rock's bloodlines were becoming more and more human, and elven blood was becoming more and more diluted. It was inexorable at this point that the Bretons would someday come to inherit the Durani hegemony, and that's exactly what happened. Slowly and surely, Durani influence diminished, their holdings shrank, and the vast northwestern expanses were left to Nedic Bretons. But to properly understand the downfall of the Durani, we must look to another group of Nedic settlers, the ones who ventured south over the Dural Mountains and into the land of Cyrod. Life for the Proto-Cyrodiilians, the ancestors to the Imperial race, was not so harmonious. The Durani may have placed the Western Nedes at the bottom of their social hierarchy, but the Heartland Elves were far more brutal in their treatment of men. These Heartland Elves, known as the Aelids, saw the Nedic settlers as useful tools in the construction and maintenance of their glorious empire. The Nedes made their settlements in the dense jungles, or temperate grasslands of Cyrodiil, depending on whether you believe the transcription error. And these early humans were well aware of the might of the Aelids living in their grand citadels. The Aelids were not so magnanimous towards lesser peoples, and thus they saw the Nedes as a resource like stone or wood. And the rising popularity of Daedra worship in some Aelid kingdoms only served to make matters worse. The Aelids enslaved the immigrant tribes of men, at first occasionally, but then systematically, and the Nedic people found themselves subject to masters who, in many cases, worshipped the princes, including those who encouraged slavery, domination and cruelty. Under the Aelids, the human thralls found themselves the subject of such Daedra-inspired arts as flesh sculpture and gut gardening. There was no mercy to be found under Aelid oppression, and the Nedes of Cyrod had only one option available to them: revolution. Deep in the Aelid city of Sardavar Lead, a nameless slave girl prayed to Akatosh for guidance. Her prayers were answered, and with the aid of kind son Morahouse and the star-made knight Pelennor Whitestrake, the rebellion was a resounding success. This girl was given many names, including Paravant, which means the first, and Alesh, which means High Highness. To most of the rebels, she became known as Slave Queen Alesia, and the first Cyrodiilic Empire of Men was founded. Alesia is perhaps the most famous and accomplished of all Nedes, and her legacy brought about the downfall of not only the Aelids, but also the Durani. The Durani had spread their influence thin, incorporating sections of Skyrim, Cyrodiil and Hammerfell into their dominion. While the Durani Elves were overreaching into new territory, the Bretons were busy with domestic pursuits. They were beneath the Elves, so they had no stakes in Durani imperial endeavours. The Durani leaders were learning harsh lessons about overextending their power. They fought the Elysian Order at the Battle of Glenumbra Moors, and despite victory on the battlefield, they were weakened beyond recovery. Their power waned along with their control of High Rock, and they subsequently fell back to Isle Balfiera. The Bretons, meanwhile, were operating beneath the eyes of history, and their rise in High Rock was through commerce and the foundation of small villages in well-chosen positions, such as the sleepy fishing hamlet of Wayrest, on the coast between the Builsay River and the Iliac Bay. Daggerfall, Camlorn, Reich Gradkeep, and many other cities became Breton not by any act of war, but simply by being assimilated by them. By the end of the First Era, High Rock was the land of the Bretons, and would be so ever after. And so, these early centuries of the First Era truly solidified the end of the Malefic times. Remember that Malefic translates to Era of the Elves in the Nordic tongue. The Era of Elves was over in Cyrodiil, where Alesia and her Nedic rebels toppled the barbarous Aelids, paving the way for the many imperial dynasties to follow, while the Bretons had taken a less aggressive, yet equally effective approach, replacing the Durani Elves purely by population growth. Ysgramor and his Atmorans also ended the reign of another elven race, the Farmer in Skyrim. But how about we talk about another Nedic group? There were also Nedic settlers to the south of High Rock, in the Deathlands of Volenfell, modern-day Hammerfell. These Nedes became known as the Durani Nedes, and remnants of their civilization can be seen in the Craglorn region. Great towers stand the test of time, and are a fine example of a Nedic group that wasn't completely impeded by adversarial elves. They faced Aelid invaders from the east, and Dwemer from below, yet they endured. There are surviving Nedic texts which speak of a cataclysmic event called the Autumn of Snakes, in which hundreds of snakes, many the size of mammoths, emerged from the ground and devoured whole towns before finally being subdued by the Nede spear maiden, Runev the Coal-eyed Wanderer. But this is more likely Nedic mythology than history. Another thing we know about the Durani Nedes before their downfall is that they were fervent followers of the cosmos. They venerated the constellations. And the last information we have on the Durani Nedes involves the Council of 9 Kings. As far as I know, they weren't given 9 rings, but they were doomed to die. There's the Blood, Flame, Forest, Frost, Shadow, Spirit, Storm and Sun kings, and chief among these Nedic kings was High King Durak. The Forest King was named Kestic, and it is likely that his domain included present-day Falkreath. We've heard plenty of stories about Nedes being oppressed by elves, but in the case of Durak and his council, the roles were reversed. Durak's daughter, Saradin, fell in love with an Altmer named Vermeril, Durak's advisor. Only Durak refused to allow his daughter to marry a Mer. Instead, he wished to betroth her to Kestic, the Forest King. Vermeril pleaded with Saradin to run away with him, but she refused. Devastated at being scorned, Vermeril plotted his betrayal of the Nedic kings. While the council was convening to discuss how best to repel the invading Yakudans, Vermeril slaughtered them. He then turned himself into a lich, but was sealed away in the Skyreach catacombs by the surviving Nedes. This betrayal greatly weakened the Durani Nedes, and when the Yakudan warrior waves came to Hammerfell, they were completely outmatched and were wiped out. The Reachmen of Western Skyrim and Eastern High Rock are generally believed to share the same lineage as the Bretons, but they are described as the most mongrel of the human races, because they seem to have Keptu ancestry as well. The Keptu were a group of human settlers who inhabited large parts of Western Tamriel, from central Hammerfell to the hinterlands of Eastern Cyrodiil, so the Witchmen have some combination of Nedic blood from the peoples of High Rock, Skyrim, Cyrodiil, and Hammerfell. Perhaps the most ambiguous of the Nedic migrations is the one that went east from Skyrim. When we think of Resdain, or Morrowind as it is known these days, we think of the Chimer, Dunmer and Dwemer, not of humans. The Nords took chunks of Morrowind at the height of their great empire, but this was long after the initial Nedic settlers would have arrived. The only reliable evidence for Nedic civilization in Morrowind comes from Frontier Conquest, which states that these so-called Nedic peoples include the Proto-Cyrodiilians, the ancestors of the Bretons, the Aboriginals of Hammerfell, and perhaps a now vanquished human population of Morrowind. but it does explicitly say perhaps in Morrowind, and later says possibly Morrowind. There is a concurring text titled The Brothers of Strife, which speaks of the ancient conflict between Ned and Keimer, though its credibility is debatable, as it was written much later in the Mid-Second Era, during the Ebonheart Pact. It says, "Then came the Nedes. Though the Nords of today are allies, the Nedes were adversaries of the darkest nature. They sought only land, conquest and spoils. We extended open hands of diplomacy, which they lopped off. Any elf in the Horde's path was fair game, man, woman or child." This seems very uncharacteristic of the early Nedic migrations, even when we take into consideration the varying subcultures of the Atmoran men. It seems much more characteristic of the relentlessly expansionist Nordic Empire. Yet there is some validity to the assertions, as preserved Nedic wineskins have supposedly been found in the Stonefalls region of Morrowind. Either way, it is likely that these Nedes, if they were present in Morrowind, were around much later than the initial Nedic migrations. The last place to visit is the most unlikely one. There is one corner of Tamriel that few races can abide. It is a place where the air is noxious and the plant life is pestiferous, where beasts lurk beneath the murky waters and venomous snakes linger in the reeds. It is believed that some of the early Nedes travelled southeast, into the home of the lizard folk, Blackmarsh. There are 4 known tribes, the Horwali, Orma, Yespest, and the Kothringi. Little is known of the first 3, and scholars are unsure of how they arrived in Blackmarsh at all, but fortunately we have more information on the silver-skinned Kothringi. The presence of men in Argonia has long perplexed historians. Few races other than the Argonians have been able to endure the perils of this province, and all but the lizards have eventually gone extinct. It seems the same is true for the Kothringi. Traces of these silver-skinned men have been found in Shadowfen, as well as in the city of Gideon. It is said they generally prefer to be naked, which is a bold choice in a land infested with flesh flies. And they were also avid sailors, which would suggest a strong Kothringi presence in Blackmarsh's coastal regions. The Kothringi were wiped to extinction by the notorious Nahatan flu, which ravaged Tamriel for 43 years in the Second Era. This plague originated in the marsh and emanated from there. Many scholars claim that the widespread nature of the flu was exacerbated by the propensity for the Kothringi to sail across Tamriel as far as Hammerfell. The Argonians were immune to the disease, but the human tribes were not. Thus, their sailing spread the disease all the way to the continent's west. There is no undisputed evidence that the tribes of Blackmarsh were Nedic, but it is more likely than them being true natives to Tamriel. The best evidence we have comes from hearsay. The Dunmerry soldier Lodnya Arefi, stationed at the ruins of Zook in central Shadowfen, has this to say about the Kothringi. Some say they were descended from the Nedic humans. They lived in Blackmarsh as far back as records go. The Nahatan flu destroyed their culture. There are rumours of some infected Kothringi sailing on a crimson ship, away from Tamriel, never to be seen again. But their survival is unlikely, and with the extinction of the Kothringi, we've covered the last of the Nedic migrations. To say the Nords had a significant impact on Tamriel would be quite the understatement, and human history on the continent would be sparse without Isgramor chronicling the achievements of his people. But that does not change the fact that he was not the first to lead men to Dawn's beauty. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Drew, this is FudgeMuppet, and I'll see you in the next one.